What is up, ladies and gents? This is George Bean, and in this video, I finally conclude the Captain America trilogy with my review for the 2016 Marvel superhero film, Captain America, The Winter Soldier, the Captain America Civil War, which was the third installment in the Captain America trilogy, and the 13th overall in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was once again directed by Anthony and Joe Russo, and written by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, both of whom all directed previously done the work for The Winter Soldier for the previous film, and produced by Marvel Studios CEO Kevin Feige, whom we can call as the de facto architect of the MCU, and once again stars Chris Evans as the titular superhero, with a co-starring appearance by Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Upon its release on the 6th of May of 2016, the film had received extremely positive reviews, garnering praise for the acting performances, particularly from Evans and Downey, the action, the screenplay, and themes. In addition, it was also a commercial success, grossing over $1.1 billion worldwide, effectively outgrossing its predecessor, The Winter Soldier. The film had become the highest-grossing film of 2016 and the overall 12th highest-grossing film of all time. The plot: after the Battle of Sokovia in Avengers Age of Ultron, the political landscape begins to butt in more on the Avengers due to their actions somewhat causing collateral damage. And thus the politicians opt to sign a new law called the Sokovia Accords, which would put any and all superhumans under oversight. However, even through all this, Cap finds that his friend Bucky Barnes, or the Winter Soldier, has been framed for a terrorist attack, and now must ally with those willing to help him in saving his friend, even when knowing full well that it would be to the detriment of his own freedom, thus pitting him against fellow Avenger Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, in what would become a civil war between the Avengers. One thing I should feel the need to mention is that this film is based, rather very loosely, on the 2006 comic book story arc similarly titled Civil War, but much like The Winter Soldier, it only takes the central premise and a few key elements from the comic, whilst everything else is radically changed for the film, and mainly for the sake of tying it into the overall Marvel cinematic universe, and for the sake of audience engagement. Most of the audience may not have read the Civil War comic book, I myself included. It is exactly like what had happened in the case of X-Men Days of Future Past. It is an adaptation of the original Days of Future Past comic book story arc, but many big liberties were made in adapting it for the sake of trying to adapt it into a movie that runs at the length of 2 hours, and for the sake of audience engagement. In the comic, the time traveler was, like, for example, in the Days of Future Past comic, the time traveler was Kitty Pryde, but in the movie it was changed to Wolverine because he was the more popular character to the movie-going audience. But if there was one huge example for me to bring up between the movie and comic book for this case, it is the depiction of the Sokovia Accords. Now, in the comic, the Accords are rather referred to as the Superhero Registration Act, and it is designed to have the superheroes and overall all people with superhuman abilities to register with the federal government as a human weapon of mass destruction, reveal their true identity to the authorities, and then undergo proper training, and that those who sign in also have the option of working for S.H.I.E.L.D., earning a salary and benefits such as those earned by other American servants, And so Captain America opposes the law on the grounds that it violates civil liberties and the protection that secret identities provide. But in the film, the Registration Act, now referred to in the film as the Sokovia Accords, was changed to focus more on the issue of government control, oversight, and the accountability, rather than public knowledge of secret identities. Matters also being escalated by the interference and manipulation of the main villain of the film as his plan for revenge against the Avengers. The screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely had stated that they had began work on the screenplay for this film in late 2013, borrowing elements from the 2006 comic book storyline similar to Civil War, while also focusing on story and character elements from the previous Captain America films to conclude the trilogy. However, despite this, they had originally planned something much smaller initially, in that it was going to be more of a smaller film with Zemo detonating the Mad Bomb, which would turn hordes of people into berserkers to present a physical threat to Cap, while still pitting heroes against each other, as some would be zombified due to the Mad Bomb. But it was Kevin Feige who came to them with the idea of adapting Civil War instead, which was something he had had in mind for a long while, according to the writers. And in February 2014, Anthony and Joe Russo had signed on to return as directors for this film, which came as a result of the Marvel executives being impressed with test screenings of their work on The Winter Soldier. The Russos had stated that this film was a continuation of the story from The Winter Soldier, describing both films as being like a two-parter for them, focusing on the journey that the Winter Soldier character goes through. And they had also stated that they were looking to make this film's tone as an amalgam, like an amalgamation of the first Avenger and Winter Soldier, even going so far as to liken it to a psychological thriller, thus citing films like Seven, Fargo, and The Godfather's influences, along with westerns and even Brian De Palma films. I will say, the films they had cited as influences to this film, I mean, damn, that is impressive to say the least. One thing to mention is that up until 2015, Kevin Feige was not exactly the CEO of Marvel Studios. His predecessor was a man named Ike Perlmutter. Now to bring up, according to YouTube channel Midnight's Edge, Perlmutter had become well known as a prick who had adamantly refused to produce superhero films in which the superheroes were either female or black. So he was the reason why movies like Black Panther and Captain Marvel had taken so long to get off the ground, because he was, to put it simply, a sexist and a racist. And apparently Perlmutter had wanted Downey to have less screen time in this film, but Downey had insisted on being in this film prominently, not only because his role was integral in the Civil War story, but it also meant a bigger paycheck. However, Perlmutter furiously considered removing Downey out of the film entirely, which had meant Civil War without Iron Man. But Kevin Feige, having had enough of Perlmutter's shit, had went to the Disney head honchos and had threatened to quit unless Perlmutter was ousted, and so Disney, not wanting to lose Kevin Feige anytime soon, had chosen to stay with Feige and oust Perlmutter. And so with Perlmutter out, Feige had effectively become the de facto CEO of Marvel Studios, and so he can speak directly to Disney without having to go through Perlmutter. And this had happened in the aftermath of Avengers 2 Age of Ultron's release. The Variety magazine had noted that Downey, when formally casted into the film, would would receive a salary of $40 million plus back-end for his participation, as well as an additional payout if the film had outperformed The Winter Soldier, as Marvel would attribute that success to Downey's presence, to which the film did, no surprise. And it also shows that Marvel knows full damn well that Downey had practically become their golden boy on this franchise. And really, it's true. If it wasn't for Downey being in Iron Man, this franchise probably would not have succeeded as far as it has now. Now to say, this movie had also introduced Spider-Man into the MCU after Sony Pictures had decided to make a deal with Marvel after the former's 2014 film The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had underperformed at the box office, which as a result had effectively destroyed their plans for a Spidey-centered cinematic universe, which had included spin-off films focusing on the Sinister Six, Venom, Black Cat, and Silver Sable. If you want to learn more about what the Sony's Spideyverse plans were, check out the Midnight's Edge video about it. I will provide a link to the video in the description box and comment section below the video, and please, go watch the video. It is 40 minutes long, so grab a soda and pizza, relax on the couch, and enjoy the ride you will be getting yourself into. Trust me. Now, to say for me, I had saw this movie in the cinema along with my pops, and we both enjoyed it a lot, as well as the big audience we were with. The whole theater had a blast seeing it. We were all even chuckling and laughing at the more humorous moments, such as when Tony and Peter are interacting with each other when meeting for the first time. But yes, me, my pops, and the whole theater had a lot of fun seeing this on that one night in early May 2016, and was definitely worth the wait, 1 year wait after Avengers Age of Ultron. Chris Evans was again stellar as Steve Rogers or Captain America, even in this film. Much like in his previous 2 solo films, Cap feels he needs to do something because it is mostly from the bottom of his heart, even when he knows full well that it goes against what the governmental big bosses says so. In this film, when his friend Bucky Barnes is framed for a terrorist attack, he does what he can to protect Bucky from being killed by the authorities, and hopefully clear his name and proclaim his innocence, even when it is to the detriment of himself becoming a fugitive. Robert Downey Jr., as always, is outstanding as Tony Stark or Iron Man. It is nice to see the character evolving and growing as the MCU series progresses. Here he has grown up here, and is now trying to redeem himself for having created Ultron, which was initially designed by him to be an AI peacekeeping program and a temporary substitute for the Avengers. But of course, we all know how that's turned out. Ultron went rogue and became obsessed with causing human extinction. Now he's trying to fix that by willingly siding with the UN and approving the Sokovia Accords. But in every way, this has also caused a rift to form between him and Rogers. And as someone who honestly sides with Rogers, it does make me a bit pissy when Stark does things, specifically such as keeping Wanda or Scarlet Witch confined at the Avengers compound, mostly since it is against her own free will. She's not allowed to go out and even go shopping for half an hour. I hated that one quick moment when he refers to her as a weapon of mass destruction. That pissed me off so much. I was like, well, you are a weapon of mass destruction too, Tony. The government called you that once on C-SPAN in Iron Man 2, remember? But yeah, Downey is still great as Tony Stark in these films. I want to put this on record, but he will be remembered as Iron Man even long after he dies. I just want everyone to know that here on this very video. As for Sebastian Stan, he still did a stellar job as Bucky Barnes here, after having gone through a radical change to play as Bucky's assassin alter ego, the Winter Soldier, in the previous film. But he is trying to regain his lost memories as Bucky, but ends up being framed by the main villain Zemo and becomes a hunted down fugitive. As I said in my Winter Soldier review, I'd say Bucky possibly has the best character development in the Cap trilogy because of the shit he ends up going through in these three films. Was once friends with Captain America, was thought to have been KIA'd in World War II, but has actually spent 70 years being Frankensteined into a mindless soldier by the enemy, all against his will, mind you, and is then hunted down by like a terrorist for the actions he had been forced into committing. All of that really makes him a tragic person in these films. I do want to say that I do like Elizabeth Olsen in these films as Wanda Maximoff or Scarlet Witch. I like how Scarlet Witch knows how powerful she really is, but she is simply just a kid, very young, and she just wants to help out in any way she can to make up for whatever mess she had created in Age of Ultron. You know, at the time when I first heard about her in Age of Ultron, I swear to you, I did not know that she was related to Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen. I mean, her last name should have been a dead giveaway to me very early on, but it had really took me a while to figure it out that she was the lesser known of the Olsens. And I do have to say, I was and still am impressed by her. I had never minded her Scarlet Witch performances. One thing I do love about her is that apparently one of her favorite films was the movie Tremors, of which she grew up on as a child, and that is fucking awesome of her. Yay, Tremors, lol. And you know what? If they are planning to continue the Tremors series at any time soon, I believe she should be in at least one of them. So Hollywood, please do it. And another thing to mention, which I may not have mentioned in my quickie review for Avengers 2 when I saw it in cinema, but to bring it up, Wanda Maximoff, aka Scarlet Witch, and their brother Pietro Maximoff, aka Quicksilver, in the comics they are actually the children of Magneto and are in essence mutants. But these are never mentioned in the MCU films, due to legal issues between Marvel Studios and 20th Century Fox. Now, Quicksilver was featured in Fox's X-Men films, and was very much mentioned to be Magneto's son in those films. But the big reason why there are two different versions of Quicksilver in both X-Men and Days of Future Past and Avengers Age of Ultron was again because of a legal agreement made between Marvel and Fox. They came to an agreement allowing both studios to use the character, with the condition that they could not make any reference to the other studio's properties. So the Fox films cannot mention them as members of the Avengers, while the Marvel films cannot mention them as mutants or children of Magneto. But now with Marvel Studios' parent studio Disney having purchased the Fox studio, thus making Fox a Disney subsidiary, this may likely change in the future. You never know, we'll see how it goes. And also another thing to mention about Quicksilver, which is quite ironically funny, is that both Quicksilvers in the Fox and Marvel films were both played by Evan Peters and Aaron Taylor Johnson, who were both in the 2010 superhero comedy film Kick-Ass. Which is actually very funny there. They were both in Kick-Ass, and then years later they both end up playing two different Quicksilvers. Isn't that something to think about? Go figure. Now, I really like Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa or Black Panther, especially in this film. What I like is that in this film, he's more neutral in terms of those whose side he is on. He doesn't particularly care about being on any side at all. He just wants to get to Bucky to avenge his father. But in the end, when he finally meets his father's true killer, Zemo, and sees what he had become by letting revenge consume him, T'Challa rather refuses to let it consume him too, and instead chooses to take Zemo into custody. This is a great lesson for T'Challa to learn, especially since this has happened before his first solo film happens. Because if he had let himself become consumed by revenge and kill Zemo, this would likely have had made him more like Killmonger in the Black Panther film. Wakanda would likely have fallen under the control of a bloodthirsty, vengeful dictator in T'Challa. So it's good that he had chosen to let go of his hate and become more of a man of justice. One thing I really need to mention about Black Panther is that in the original first drafts for this film, T'Challa was actually going to have a much smaller role and did not even appear in costume, as the writers had intended to put more focus on Spider-Man and save Black Panther's origin for his own movie. However, it then seemed very unlikely that the permission deal between Marvel and Sony was going to happen. So the deal being that Sony would allow Spider-Man to appear in the film in the MCU after The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had failed to click with audiences and underperformed at the box office. And so the writers had decided to beef up T'Challa's role significantly. But then, by the time they did get to use Spider-Man for the film, T'Challa had already become so integral to the plot that they had ultimately decided to leave his role as it is and give Spider-Man a smaller part, as we see it as is in the final film we now have been given here. So yeah, Black Panther's first solo film was originally going to be an origin story, but after his origin was instead featured in Civil War, his solo film was retooled to instead focus on his returning to his home Wakanda, his struggles in becoming the newfound king there, and thus his having to combat a new threat in the form of Killmonger. And if you ask me, I'd say that what we ended up with has become all for the better. His first solo film not being an origin story and instead feeling more like a continuation of his story in Captain America Civil War. I'd say that worked out perfectly well. And finally to say is that Daniel Bruhl did a brilliant job as Helmut Zemo, a Sokovian colonel turned terrorist who becomes obsessed with defeating the Avengers. As part of his attempt to avenge his family's deaths caused by the battle between the Avengers and Ultron in Sokovia. Even though he may not be very faithful to his comic book counterpart, but in the movie as a tragic villain, I honestly like him. What I like most about Zemo is that he does not have any superpowers to fight the Avengers, like Loki or Ultron. He is a simple human being, but he works around that by using his military training and meticulous planning to combat the super team. Not by physically fighting them, but by using psychological warfare to tear them apart. Something both Loki and Ultron had tried to do, but failed at doing so. It is just amazing. A simple human had succeeded in what a demigod and a steroided Terminator had failed to do in tearing the Avengers apart like that. I am seriously impressed there. And to say, I can definitely tell that Zemo in this film was very much influenced by John Doe in Seven, and maybe even the Joker in The Dark Knight, which I believe are two very good inspirations for a villain like this. What I like is that we are never told outright about his family's deaths. We are shown of him receiving phone calls from his family, wanting him to visit them, but he wants to defeat the Avengers. But by the end of the film, and we are finally revealed that his family had died in the Sokovia battle, we realize that the phone calls he had been receiving were actually the final message from them, as we could only hear their voices through that message. It's a truly sad thing to think of, as it was the only way in which he could hear their voices by that phone message. It does make us feel sorry for him there, especially in the one moment when he talks about how it took him 2 days to find his family's bodies in the rubble, and he then says, "And the Avengers? They went home." I mean, damn, that is just heart-wrenching to hear that from a villain like that. So it's no wonder why he would do this. And what I'd like to bring up is that in Age of Ultron, the final battle was set in Sokovia, a little Eastern European town from the comics. And obviously, Sokovia is shown and described as being a failed state. Sokovia was a nice little change from having the battle being set in a more metropolitan city like New York, like in the first Avengers. And not only that, but the Battle of Sokovia actually sets up the consequences that is to be explored in Civil War. One huge consequence comes in the form of Helmut Zemo, so that's something there. To bring up, this film was released the same year as another superhero film that is extremely similar to this. That film being the DC film, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which had also pitted two prominent superheroes being pitted against each other as a result of political issues and a villain manipulating them. In BVS, the villain is Lex Luthor, who, much like Zemo, is manipulating the two heroes into fighting each other. Both movies feature a scene where a political building is bombed by the villain to make matters worse for the heroes. But if you ask me, I feel that Civil War is superior to BVS, because to me, everything that BVS had tried to do, this film had somewhat done it better, such as the political bombing having a lasting repercussion afterwards, or how torn apart the heroes are. But for one big example, in this film, I like how there feels to be a much more solidified motivation behind the titular Civil War. It is not only because of the Sokovia Accords, but it's also mainly because of Bucky being framed for a terrorist bombing that was committed during the Accords signing at a UN building in Vienna. Zemo knows that such a terrorist attack will get everyone to come hunt down Bucky, especially Black Panther, whose father was killed in the bombing, so of course Black Panther desires to avenge his father's death. What I do also like is how it references the 2008 film The Incredible Hulk by having Thunderbolt Ross appearing in this film, as played by William Hurt, no longer a military general, but is now the Secretary of State. I am glad that they chose to keep The Incredible Hulk in feeling integral in the overall MCU and not be forgotten, because it shows that every chapter is very important in the overall franchise. But all for all, I still did not like Ross, much like how I did not like him in The Incredible Hulk, because he is like an antagonist as he always was, and he's also an authority figure as well. I'm not a fan of authority. But one thing is that pissed me off about him is that after Stark had finally realized who Zemo was and that Bucky was actually framed by him, When Stark had arrived at the Raft prison and had given Ross the evidence about Zemo and suggested looking for him, Ross had refused to listen, saying, "You seriously think I'm going to listen to you after that fiasco at the Leipzig airport? You're lucky you're not in one of these prison cells." That pissed me off. So he's not going to look for Zemo and still go after Steve and Bucky as fugitives, even with all the evidence to prove their innocence handed to him? Well then, fuck you, man. And to say, I could go out of my way, it's a bit of a thing I need to mention, but I mentioned it to my pops, but I could go out of my way to say that the MCU certainly feels very much like our modern day film serial. Remember back in the 1930s and 40s, we had film serials to go out to see in theaters, which were used as a way to escape from the hardships of life that had been brought about by the Great Depression at the time. So now, the MCU is like a film serial today, a big, massive, big budget film serial. We see these movies as a way to escape from everyday life. So think about it. There is a reason why we keep going out to see these movies even to this day. It is our form of escapism from the hardships of our everyday life. Sometimes we just want to spend 2 hours in a big theater room to go see a movie that entertains us as a form of escapism again. But the best scene in this film has to be the airport battle scene, when the Avengers have finally come together with Ant-Man and even Spider-Man included. Oh yeah, Ant-Man is in this movie, believe it or not. And end up battling each other at the airport. What I should say is that this film is kind of structured like Empire Strikes Back. The big battle scene happens somewhere in the middle of the film, allowing for the final climax to have a smaller but more personal fight. While in Empire, the big battle of Hoth happens at the end of the first act, in this film, the airport battle happens at the end of the second act. So this battle is not the climactic battle. Unlike how in the Avengers films, the big battle happens in the final climax. In all honesty, I do like that here. They have the big airport battle scene happen in the middle act. Just because it is the big battle, that doesn't mean it has to happen in the climax. And so when the climax comes around and instead goes for a more, again, smaller but personal fight between the hero and villain, much like in Empire. And to say, what I'm about to say here about the climax has a huge spoiler, so if you have not seen the movie yet, turn off this video and go watch the movie right now, because I'd hate to spoil it for you in this video. Okay? Now, let's go. So for the climax, which features a smaller but personal fight, you can tell that the climactic scene was influenced very prominently by not only the ending in Empire Strikes Back, but also by the head-in-the-box twist in the David Fincher thriller 7, because much like in that film, the villain reveals to one of the heroes something that ends up triggering them to fly into a rage-filled breakdown and make them want to kill someone. So in 7, the villain John Doe reveals that he had murdered Mills' wife and send her head in the delivery box, and this causes Mills to shoot John Doe dead in a fit of violent rage, even to the objections of his partner Somerset, who had tried to talk him out of it. But in this film, the villain Zemo reveals to Stark a video which shows Bucky cold-bloodedly murdering Stark's parents in 1991, which ends up prompting Stark to attack and even tried to kill Bucky in a fit of violent rage, even to the fighting objections of his fellow Avenger and Bucky's best friend Rogers, who tries to protect Bucky and stop Stark. But again, Zemo's revelation about Stark's parents being murdered by Bucky thus prompts Stark to violently lash out, and Rogers fights Stark to stop him. And so this leads into a three-way fight between the three heroes. I will say this fight is very well done. I really like how the fight was choreographed. It is also very heartbreaking to see these three friends end up fighting each other over a big secret like that. But also, it is also Roger's fault for keeping it a secret from Stark like that. If he'd have told him beforehand, yeah, sure, Stark would have gotten very angry for it, but I'm sure Stark would have cooled off under much better circumstances than he was here, and possibly may have tried to be helpful to both Rogers and Bucky. But to mention on a side note, this is a changing the subject side note. I have heard a lot of people making claim that these movies are for kids. I mean, young kids, citing the fact that Disney distributes these films, as a major complaint factor for their arguments. And here I am thinking, really? These movies are specifically for little kids? Movies that feature scenes that involve such adult elements such as terrorism and death in it? And I mean that. These movies, especially in the Captain America and Iron Man movies, all feature terrorism in it, and like post 9/11 terrorism at least. In Iron Man 3, you have scenes that suggest suicide bombings, and it features a villain that has a strong resemblance to Osama bin Laden, and even the video messages bin Laden had made. I mean, I'm sorry, ladies and gents, but I just get frustrated when these people keep complaining about these movies being made only for little kids, when on the contrary, just by watching these films, that they are also made for young adolescents and even adults too. I mean, come on. But now, in a fitting conclusion, in a modest way, this movie does feel less like a Captain America film and more like Avengers 2.5. But even through all that, it is still very much Captain America's film, all the way. This is still his story. What I like about the Captain America trilogy is that it starts out with him as a patriot, and in this film it ends with him becoming an insurgent. What I like about this film is that there is no one side in the battle. It rather focuses on both sides. It is not like a versus movie like, say, Freddy vs. Jason or even Batman v Superman, which tended to focus on one side over the other. There is a reason why this movie is called Captain America Civil War and not Captain America vs. Iron Man. It is not a literal versus movie. It shows both sides of the war. And yes, in the grand scheme of things, they could have simply given this film a title as simple as Captain America vs. Iron Man or even Avengers Civil War. But no, they instead chose to title it as Captain America Civil War, maintaining it as a Captain America installment. It shows just how much respect they have to their fans. The very fans who have made the original comic books very popular in the first place, and who have made this franchise possible and successful so far. So, overall, I feel the need to give Captain America Civil War a rating of 9 stars out of 10 because it is a well-written chapter in the overall MCU and a well-deserved successor to the Winter Soldier. And it is more than just another versus movie that effectively show both sides of the battle. And it also manages to handle featuring up to a dozen characters without it feeling like a jumbled mess. This is yet another amazingly stellar addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and definitely worth putting on your shelf alongside the other Marvel films. So, thank you for watching, ladies and gents. I hope this has been helpful to you in me reviewing the Captain America trilogy. So, and I will be continuing making more videos in the future, despite the long periods of time it takes for me in between videos. So thank you for watching, ladies and gents, and until then, I will see you all next time. Peace!